All right, we're now recording. Dr. Ruwan M. Jayatunge, PhD, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. You are a doctor and clinical psychologist, a member of the American Psychological Association, and a former commissioned officer in the Sri Lankan Army. You've treated soldiers at the Colombo Military Hospital, becoming one of the first in Sri Lanka to study and document the effects of PTSD, which I just find so interesting. You've authored numerous books and peer-reviewed articles and bring a rare blend of field experience and academic knowledge to this conversation. So thank you, sir, so much for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time. I am super excited to talk to you. I think we share a lot of interests, and you kind of operate in a space that I really know nothing about in terms of conflicts going on around the world, best forms of actually treating PTSD. So maybe the best place to start in this conversation, I don't know how my introduction was for you, would be to define what PTSD is, how you began working in the field, and kind of how you see how the field has evolved over time. So again, sir, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show, and I hope we have a fruitful conversation.
Thank you, Max. It's my privilege to have this interview with you. Because my journey started several decades ago. I started reading about PTSD. Actually, I was so I took very much interest reading about combat trauma history, and even after seeing movies like Coming Home, Deer Hunter, and the movies like that, I sort of figured out that the war affects human psyche. And then I started reading about Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Julius Caesar, even some of the World War II generals, the German generals and the US generals, and especially the Vietnam War. And I studied in Ukraine for 7 years. By the time I went to Ukraine, the Afghan conflict has taken into action. And I lived with two medical students who had served in Afghanistan. One of them, I think he was affected by war trauma because he suffered a concussion, probably suffered from traumatic brain injury. At that time, I didn't have much of profound knowledge about war trauma and PTSD. So that first-hand experience allowed me to witness and learn about how personality changes following combat trauma. After completing my medical degree, I came to Sri Lanka and started working as a medical officer of mental health in the community. Then we had a 30-year war, and I decided to work with the military. And I had the privilege of working with one psychiatrist, Dr. Neil Fernando. He's a very prominent psychiatrist in our part of the world. And the time we were working with the military, the common notion was there was no American Vietnam syndrome in Sri Lanka. Our combatants didn't have.
Which is a completely ridiculous concept. Why would
at that time even some of the
psychology
doctors
affect only one group of people versus not another?
Yeah, because we had brilliant surgeons, we had brilliant physicians who were treating the soldiers who fought in the war front, and only thing is a psychological factor. I think we forgot to address that psychological issues followed by the war. And some of the top brass believe that it would sort of, you're going to open a can of worms. Like if you start talking about war trauma, it could lead to unnecessary problems. But we realized not addressing war trauma, it hinders the military strategy because there were a lot of self-harm, a lot of bunker suicides, and a lot of desertion and low productivity. And some of the soldiers, they had this avoiding factor and didn't want to go back to combat. These were very good soldiers. Later, they have a drastic personality changes. So we started treating these people. Then we tried to publish some research papers, and then we tried to convince the military and the medical staff, medical administration. It was a sort of a bitter crusade, but eventually we were able to convince them. And in the meantime, there were other international publications which came from the US, especially by my friend Ethan Watters, and we had some email communications with Ethan. He wrote a very thought-provoking book, The Americanization of Mental Illnesses. He first thought that PTSD is a sort of a culture defined and imposed on other cultures, and other countries and cultures embrace that. Somehow I debunked Ethan Watters, the whole idea, writing a book and writing a research paper. My book was called Shell Shock to Palali Syndromes, PTSD Sri Lankan Experience. And my paper that was published by the US Army Foreign Military Office. And there I highlighted PTSD, not an American illness. It was there. It was throughout the history. It's even if you go through some ancient Egyptian literature, you find PTSD.
So
Described by
PTSD, so PTSD is a psychological response to a traumatic event. Is that is that the definition you would use? And then in addition, what are the maybe 5 most common ways to identify PTSD? You mentioned avoidance. I don't know. You kind of have a stereotype of people waking up in sweats, in cold sweats from a nightmare, reliving the experience. Is that kind of some of the things that you have identified as being most common characteristics, and is that how you would define PTSD?
Yeah, actually, PTSD has its own psychological symptoms, like they are reliving the traumatic experiences. They have intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance, and their functionality is being affected. And some people have depression-related symptoms, and also they have noise intolerance, anger issues. As a coping methods, they would do drugs, alcohol, and sometimes compulsive gambling, and even sex addiction. So it's a huge component and a huge conglomerate of symptoms, even though it's classified as an anxiety disorder. But actually, PTSD came from our evolution, because 20 years ago we were hunter-gatherers and we were exposed to numerous threats in the outer environment. So our brain is hardwired for danger. We constantly scan outer environment, even though we are now living in an atomic age or AI age, whatever you call it. Still we have that fear, because modern society, we have other threats as well. We have natural disasters, man-made disasters, and even in the civil setup, we have to face dangers like automobile accidents, even abuses, various types of abuses, child abuse, work-related harassments, and mugging, and various types of assaults, terrorist attacks. So anything like that affect the person and his psychological makeup would it can manifest traumatic reactions. And
So,
my
please go on.
my EMDR guru, Dr. Francine Shafiro, she classifies 2 types of traumas, like big T traumas and small T traumas. Big T traumas, like the things which I mentioned about the huge man-made, natural and personal traumas.
Yes.
And small T traumas, like every day we encounter, like when we drive, sometimes there are certain escalations, altercations, verbal harassments, we encounter. So everything affects, and that cumulative effect. So, and that trauma can transform us. Sometimes negative transformation, sometimes positive transformation. And especially, what's your interpretation about trauma? Because I have treated number of people, and I have seen a lot of combatants and civilians who face different types of traumas, and their psychological interpretation is different. One person, he was shattered by artillery fire. Another officer told me that, what is artillery fire? Nothing, it's just like rain. I would go under a bunker and I enjoy the moment. I enjoy that flashes, that lights. It's for me, it's a game like playing Call of Duty. It's sort of, so each person, their threshold is different, and their psychological interpretation is different, and their worldview is different, because we all come from different households. We have different childhoods and different childhood experiences, and it affects a lot of ethnic factors are there, cultural factors are there. Sometimes the culture is a buffer, sometimes culture push you to certain types of traumas. And I think every PTSD patient is unique.
Are there common ways to treat PTSD? Maybe ones that you've had more success or less success with?
Yeah, generally, we when we talk about treatment of PTSD, we use medication, benzodiazepines for a very very short period too, because those have addictive properties, especially clonazepam, diazepam, and you cannot give it for a long time. It's I would say maximum in our Canadian experience, we would give them for 7 days or 10 days maximum.
And what is the reason to give them those drugs?
To stabilize the patient, sometimes to because these people, they are unable to sleep, to establish their sleep regime. Sometimes even drugs like melatonin would work, and they have depression components. So we have to give them SSRIs like fluoxetine, paroxetine. Sometimes these PTSD patients have psychotic symptoms. We call it Kessler phenomena, because researcher Kessler found 16% of PTSD patients can have psychotic symptoms. I can give you two examples, one from Sri Lanka, one from North America. I remember one psychiatrist who were seeing patients in the civil setup referred a patient, combatant to us, a soldier, who was hearing helicopter sounds. So the psychiatrist thought it was a hallucination. Then I did the psychological assessment and found that it was not a auditory hallucination. It was a flashback, PTSD flashback, because this hearing this helicopter sound, it's sort of connected to his initial trauma. And
Absolutely.
secondly, when I was studying at York University, I was doing my placement. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Goran Erivac at North York General Hospital in Canada, and there was a patient who was wrongly diagnosed as having bipolar affective disorder, and she had fear of cancer, and she would go into agitation. She would go into severe anxiety reactions, having fear of this breast cancer. So the doctors thought it was bipolar affective disorder. But with Dr. Goran Erivac, I had the opportunity of discussing about this patient's condition. And later, I was able to convince him that it was an intrusive memories, because her mother died of a breast cancer and her sister was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she narrowly escaped. So she was a survivor. And that fear deposited in her mind, and it caused her sort of panic attacks. It gave her sort of agitation. So initially, the family doctors thought that it was a psychotic manifestation, but Later, she was treated with EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a psychotherapeutic mode like CBT, and we processed her trauma and also introduced a CBT type of interventions and rational emotive therapy that was introduced by a psychologist named Albert Elias, and different types, and mindfulness, because mindfulness is really, really wonderful, and it has no major side effects, because most of the PTSD patients, they live in the past. They are having their reminiscences. They think about their trauma, and also they go into future. They are having anxiety. So they time travel. They're like a pendulum. They go into past. They go into the future. They hardly live in the present moment. If you could remember the book written by Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now, he says if the person is focused and stay on the present moment, he is saved by an invisible capsule. No stress, no anxiety, no depression can harm him because he's protected. He's in the present moment. But the moment he shifts, when he goes to the past, which is depressive thoughts, and he goes to future, which is anxiety-related thoughts, he becomes vulnerable. And in PTSD, this shift is often happening. So with drug therapy, we stabilize the patient. With psychological interventions, we try to give some form of emotional comfort, and we do psychoeducation. And also we allow them to go practice some of the mindfulness techniques. Sometimes these people have fibromyalgia type of somatic pain, but if you do all the medical investigations, you would find there is no apparent medical reasons. There is no organic pathology associated with their somatic pain. It's anxiety generated, because anxiety can pronounce in various routes. Sometimes severe anxiety could push the person into dissociation because he moves away from reality. Sometimes he goes into psychogenic paralysis. I have seen soldiers with trigger finger paralysis. Even Freud has written about that. When talking about Freud, it's very, very important to indicate that Freud knew about PTSD, but he did not use the term PTSD. He used the term traumatic neurosis. If you read Freud very, very carefully, his case studies, the officer of Norman White, the soldier of Dardanelles, and Fraulein Elizabeth Warner, who suffered from rape trauma syndrome, aka it's another version of post-traumatic stress disorder. Freud, he knew about PTSD, and he knew its impact. He used a different term, and he had his own interpretation, because during Freud's time, he didn't have access to PET scanners, CAT scanners. He didn't know the brain function very well compared to that time, because he got his knowledge from Charcot and other neurologists. So with brain chemistry, he didn't have much of a profound knowledge. So his interpretations may have some form of errors, like, for certain psychological ailments, he tried to sort of bring Oedipus complex into that, and unresolved mental conflicts. Yes, there are certain truth behind that, but if Freud had access to the brain scans and all the facilities today we have, he would have given a better interpretation about PTSD. And American doctor who treated soldiers during the Civil War, Mendes da Costa, he knew about PTSD, but he didn't know the psychological component. He called it irritable heart, because there were a lot of soldiers following battle stress, combat fatigue, and war trauma, having cardiac reactions, chest pains, irregular heartbeats, nightmares, agitation. And he did a lot of profound studies about that. And during the World War I Colonel Dr. Frederick Mott. He studied about shell shock because the army, the military authorities thought that these patients were malingers. They were cowards. They want to evade the battlefield. That's why willfully they are presenting these shell shock type of reactions like psychogenic paralysis, psychogenic blindness, tremors, sort of avoidance. And you know that the British Army, they executed 304 soldiers for cowardice. And later, I think after 5 or 6 decades, the British government apologized to their families. And at the end of the World War One, they found nearly 60,000 men suffered from shell shock. And there was a Sri Lankan among that who fought during the World War One, probably not as a soldier, maybe he had gone as a, because a lot of Indians and Sri Lankans had gone in 1914 and 1918, the European war theater. And during the World War II, also Indian and Sri Lankan soldiers, they were in the city of Casino, Milan, and some were in Burma. So these people were exposed to combat trauma. Some came home with their emotional baggage, but they were untreated, and they went into oblivion. So we see the huge impact of war trauma, starting from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And if you read Homer's, you find Achilles, the great warrior, but he was like a partially dead man, and he had rage, survivor guilt following the death of his partner Patroclus, and he mutilates Hector's body. So you see a warrior with intense rage and some sort of savage component in him. And when we talk about Alexander the Great, he was a great warrior. He came up to Indo River, and the soldiers suffered from battle fatigue. They didn't want to march further, and there was a mutiny inside his army. And Alexander the Great, he had to turn back. And on his way back, he was exhausted. Either he was poisoned, or he suffered from yellow fever or malaria, whatever. His untimely death occurred. And Julius Caesar, he had some form of deviant behaviors following battle trauma, and very hardly we discuss. And in the history, very, very seldom they talk about that part. And Napoleon was a great tactician, but he made a drastic error invading Russia in 1812, and the Russian winter and General Kutuzov's military strategy obstructed his plan, and eventually he was defeated by the Leopard of England at the Trafalgar War, and he was sent to St. Helena. There he suffered post-combat depression. We talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. Very hardly we talk about post-combat depression following combat trauma. And I have seen a number of war veterans, Vietnam War veterans at Colombo O'Neill VA, and Iraqi veterans in Philadelphia when I was undergoing EMDR training under Dr. Susan Rogers. So we found this depression component rather than the post-traumatic component. So we find depression, post-combat depression, also a very, very prominent indicator. Therefore, we have to have very proper interventions, treatment modes, and PTSD can cause delayed reactions. Once the Mayo Wesley Clinic, they found World War II combatants, they never had any form of combat trauma symptoms soon after the World War II, but once their in their 80s and 90s, they started having delayed reactions of PTSD. And I found in our practice, I found one combatant who had delayed reaction of PTSD after 13 years. His initial trauma was happened in 1980s, and it sort of aggravated after 13 years. So we have to consider delayed reactions of PTSD as well among the combatants.
One of my favorite articles that you wrote was, and I don't know if this is too big of a jump, but was seeing the Buddha as a psychotherapist.
You're correct. Yeah,
that was one of my favorite ones you wrote, because I haven't really heard it framed like that before. You gave a number of really interesting stories. And I mean, your knowledge is obviously, wide ranging and encyclopedic. It's really amazing and interesting to listen to you, because it's
Thank
like
you, sir.
kind of sweeping story throughout time, and how everyone is connected by a common, the same kind of mental challenges that people have to face, across time, across locations. And on one aspect, I'm thinking, man, how much would the world be different if everyone meditated, if everyone journaled, if everyone had, a willingness to, I don't know if it was Jung or Freud or, one of the other psychoanalysts, that the slow exposure theory, if you're afraid of the elevator, you start 6 feet away from the elevator and then you go 5 feet slowly, kind of approaching the problem. That's kind of how I see, PTSD is, eventually you're going to need to develop some sort of healthy relationship with the trauma object. When you suppress it, it manifests and has different kind of effects on you physically and mentally, as you've described, physical effects, that trauma is stored in different places. How much could be solved if people kind of undertook the journey of, undergoing a better relationship with the trauma itself. And I guess that is the point of therapy, right? Is to help people have a better relationship with themselves being, their trauma, their, who they think they are, all their anxieties. So yeah, it's very interesting listening to you. Those are some of the things that I do a lot in my life: meditating, journaling, trying to talk to my friends, trying to let any pieces of my life that I feel aren't fully integrated see the light and kind of become part of me. And I almost think of it as like, chewing your food. If you can't eat a whole steak in one bite, or you can't eat, entire thing in one bite. You have to chew it over and over again. If something traumatic has happened to you, and, please feel free to give me your views on this, you kind of have to chew it over continuously to integrate it into your being. Because if not, it's this, this huge boulder inside of you, taking up space, pushing your other organs out of the way. That's kind of how I visualize it. So I don't know if any of that resonates with you, resonates in, how you see the field of psychotherapy. And I don't know what exactly the aspect of it connects with Buddhism as a psychotherapist, but I do think what you were speaking of earlier, there's suffering in the real world, and then there's suffering in the mind. There's two different forms of suffering. And I think Buddhism goes right to the heart of that, in its core principles. It talks about the nature of suffering, about what you can control, how you perceive things.
Well, thank you, Max. Thank you for bringing that. So before answering your question, let me say I fight my own demons. So no one is perfect. We have our own emotional baggages. So healing is a good process. One of my mentors at York University, once he said, when you heal a person, you are healing yourself. That's actually, it's cemented inside my mind. And when talk about Buddha, he actually knew, he spoke about human suffering. And when he said suffering, it's not despair. It's not the day-to-day suffering we see. Because the Buddha used the term dukkha to highlight the human suffering. It's a part of, like, it's like aging. I can give you numerous examples. When I see Kirk Douglas, when he was young, when he was playing Spartacus, he was so handsome. And even Gregory Peck, they were so handsome people. But in the latter stage, and Charlton Heston, very like elegant, beautiful, handsome individuals, but with aging, and they are in the latter periods, I see like they have sort of emaciated, that nice look has gone. Okay, it happens to each of us. Either we find cure for aging, probably maybe in within another 50 years, 100 years, we might crack the genetic code, and we can reverse the aging process. Until such time, aging is sort of a factor that we suffer, and death of our loved ones also a factor of suffering.
We back on?
Yeah. Can you see me?
Give it a second. There we go.
Okay. So Max, when we talk about the concept of Buddha, who introduced the concept of dukkha, that Buddha introduced, it has a very profound universal meaning, existential meaning. It's not the day-to-day, the suffering we see. The mistake, it was a historical error done by Anatole France. Let me explain. The Buddha's teachings first grabbed by a lot of Western philosophers. Especially Schopenhauer. He read about Buddhism, and from Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud, even Karl Marx, they were exposed to Buddhist philosophy, not very profoundly, but they had the basic understanding about Buddhism. So when Anatole France, he translated the word dukkha, the concept of dukkha, which is a very, very profound universal meaning. He used the term sufferance, which was translated into English as suffering. So ever since, a lot of Western scholars interpreted Buddhism as a religion that highlights pessimism. So the term dukkha introduced by Buddha, that's not human day-to-day human suffering, because even it's how a mundane person faces his life and his own reaction. As you mentioned, the suffering is created inside his mind. I have seen people in Las Vegas living in very, very comfortable, very, very rich neighborhoods. Sometimes they say that, I'm living in a pigsty, and I mean, they have 100 things to complain about their lives. They say, I'm not happy for this, I'm not happy for this car, I don't like my house, but they have all the comforts in their lives. And I have seen Roma people in Romania, they have nothing, in dire poverty, but they were happy and they were singing. I have seen very, very poor people in Mexico, but still in their heart, they had happiness. So what is happiness? Again, you had to go back to Viktor Frankl. Happiness is a byproduct, and same as the suffering inside your mind. So our major topic is post-traumatic stress disorder, and Buddha treated a number of PTSD patients, especially a woman who lost her infant son, and Buddha used some form of cognitive behavior therapy on her. And also there was a servant, out of despair, she tried to commit suicide. She tried to hang herself. Then Buddha intervened. So it shows crisis counseling. And there was an addictive killer who killed nearly 999 people. So Buddha went to meet this killer. He was sort of a serial killer, an addictive killer. And Buddha spoke to him very few words. And there was a cognitive revolution inside his mind. And he put his sword beside and then embraced the Buddha's nonviolent path. When talking about PTSD and Buddhist philosophy, I remember, I think 5-6 years ago, I wrote a book, Psychological Aspects of Buddhist Jataka Stories, because Buddhist Jataka stories were a form of ancient DSM. And actually, my mentor, my professor at York University, Professor Jim Alcock, he really inspired me because he always challenged the traditional ideas, and he always allowed us to think out of the box and always challenge whatever the illogical, irrational ideas. So I've been deconstructing some of the religious texts, and I found an ancient story. It's about a monk. It's called Marana Bhiruka Bhikshu in Sanskrit, and we can translate into English like this: a monk with mortal fear. This monk probably had some past trauma, and he couldn't meditate, he couldn't concentrate. A drop of a leaf would makes him jumpy. So clear indication of hyperarousal reaction. And he couldn't sleep. He was seeing nightmares. So we find the nightmare factor. And he had fear issues, and he was avoiding most of the fear inducing, fear generating things. So we find avoidance factor there. And eventually he was able to do simple meditation types like breath meditation, and gradually he was able to eliminate most of his PTSD related, trauma related distressing symptoms, and finally able to meditate, and then he gained his spiritual path. So this is a very, very good instance. Even in the Holy Bible, the book of Job, it's about trauma, and the person who endured a lot of trauma. So that narrates about post-traumatic symptomatology. And even ancient epic, Indian epic Mahabharata talks about the combat trauma. And Shakespeare, if you read Shakespeare, you find Lady Macbeth, who has nightmares, sleepwalking, dissociation, compulsive washing. So here, Shakespeare, also we can call him as medieval psychoanalyst. He elegantly writes about a PTSD type of reaction. And even Don Quixote, you may have enjoyed reading Don Quixote by Cervantes, who was a Spanish crusader, and he had vivid hallucinations, trauma-induced hallucinations. So he attributed it to this character, Don Quixote, and this pseudo knight. He fights windmills. He perceives windmills as enemy figures. I treated a soldier who saw an old truck, and he perceived it as a unicorn vehicle. Unicorn is a South African made, it's a protective vehicle for landmines. It's a huge hardware. And this soldier, one morning he woke up and he saw an abandoned old truck, and soon he perceived it as a sort of a unicorn. So I think same reaction Cervantes had, but as you said, he was journaling. That was his stress outlet. That's how he achieved his own healing, by writing. Because once you start writing, you have a lot of your neurons are firing, neural connections are forming. You put your negative memories into paper, and you get a catharsis. And also it processes your memory, it processes your traumatic memories. So it's a very, very therapeutic thing. Writing was a therapeutic thing for Cervantes. And we find a lot of people, even Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was exposed to the traumatic combat events during Spanish Civil War that prompted him to write Farewell to Arms. And in the subsequent years, he had other issues too, like alcoholism and also his radical lifestyle. So one time they called him a lost generation, and he moved to Paris. So what triggered him to commit suicide? Because he had certain paranoia, and also he had other issues. He was in Cuba, so that time he had to fight with the administration and a lot of things. Top of that, also this past combat trauma, and that triggered, and eventually he shot himself. See Mahatma Gandhi, how he transformed. It's a positive transformation. As I mentioned, psychological trauma, aka PTSD, can transform you. It can be negative transformation, it can be positive. Let me talk. We've been talking about negative transformations. Let us talk about positive transformations. Mahatma Gandhi, he saw the horror during Boer War, and lots of atrocities were committed during that time, and it changed his worldview. And after that, more and more, he embraced nonviolence. At York University, I met Professor Romeo Della, who's a Canadian general who served during Rwanda's genocide. Witnessing that trauma, he told me it triggered PTSD in him. He started drinking, he tried to commit suicide. One time he passed out. So eventually, he wanted to find a meaning for his trauma. He wanted to find. And then he started working with child soldiers and tried to bring certain meaning for his suffering. And eventually he was able to move away from his traumatic memories, traumatic symptomatology. That was a positive outcome. Same as Emperor Ashoka, who was a warrior and a sort of power hungry king, and he orchestrated a lot of wars and killed a lot of people. And in his final battle, he had certain aha moment. Then he realized, because these killings, destruction doesn't take him any further. Then he stopped waging war and embraced nonviolence. Then he started helping people and doing all good for people. That was a positive transformation of trauma. And I have seen seen how people positively transformed after a PTSD type of traumas.
There are a lot of things that you said, that I wanted to touch on. Well, one, this is like more selfishly, I don't know how much it contributes to the conversation, but I wrote a book about maybe 5-ish years ago. And it was framed as in like Soviet Russia, like Gulag Archipelago. That's what I was reading at the time. And a boy, 18 years old, finds out he's going to die in 1 month. And basically what happens over the course, he can't leave the area. He's going to die in 1 month. That was, the framing of the book. And what he does is he like writes, he writes these stories. So he writes, these two separate stories, and that kind of makes up the bulk, of his month. And I always like kind of framed it as almost like escapism or, slowing down time, by building these worlds or escaping into these other worlds, and the roles that played. But one thing you said that like I never viewed it like this before is that in both of the stories that my main character writes, his sub characters, both of those characters end up dying, and they are able to, or characters in those stories are able to kind of swallow it. They die, and then my main character, I don't know, as a byproduct of that, maybe saw his sub characters, them dying, and realized, oh, okay, this is natural. This is just something that happens. And then he's able to die, happily or peacefully, whatever it may be. So I forget exactly what you said that reminded me of that, but I'd never interpreted my own book in that way, which I think was interesting. And then obviously, me as the writer, hopefully it allows me to have a better relationship with death, with my own mortality and life in general. So thank you for that. And what was the other piece I was just going to mention?
You mentioned that, actually, you gave me sort of, you opened a new path talking about Solzhenitsyn, about Gulag Archipelago. Actually, I don't know whether you are familiar with this. I wrote a book that was titled PTSD Soviet Union, because formation of the Soviet Union in 1917 to its disintegration, the Soviet people faced a lot of trauma.
Of course.
Were orchestrated by the other sort of nations. Sometimes they had their own trauma, and there were a lot of internal calamities, and
certainly
political system like Stalinist ideas that created the huge human trauma, and it transformed Soviet people. And there were, since I lived during the Soviet era, I lived there for 7 years, and I witnessed some of these traumas and its manifestation. And I think Solzhenitsyn, he elegantly writes about these Gulag archipelagos. He gives a lot of case studies, and he writes about people who had very the guards, prison guards, who had very sadistic instincts, and some insignificant people, nobodies. Once they get power, they become somebodies. Then that they exercise that power on other people, not to heal them, not to comfort them, but to terrorize them. I think prior to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Dostoevsky wrote about these people. Because Dostoevsky also another interesting character. He had a lot of unresolved mental conflicts with his own father. Then his father was murdered by the peasants. Then he was doing some anti-government activities, subjected to mock execution. There was a drastic personality change in him, and he went into dissociative reaction, and he had psychogenic seizures until his death. He was suffering from a dissociative disorder, and he witnessed inhuman prison systems. How, like, if you read a few of his books, you can find how terrible were the living conditions there, and that really affected his psyche. And upon his release, he was a traumatized person suffering from probably post-traumatic stress disorder. He becomes a compulsive gambler, and writing was his own salvation. Writing gave him a very good path for healing. So his books, especially Brothers Karamazov, he discussed about the morality, the existence of God, and human suffering, human trauma, also materialism. Even in Dostoevsky, there was certain duality. Like, he was a brilliant writer. In the meantime, there was sort of a very, very egoistic person inside him. The rumor says that one he raped a girl who came to him to discuss about literary matters, and he was a compulsive gambler. Sometimes he had no empathy for his family or his infant child. He sold the child's items in order to go for gambling. So here we see sort of a saint-like person and also a certain type of demon. And he openly writes about that. He openly talks about that. Like Count Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy, one time, he was a brave soldier, fought during Sevastopol War, affected by combat trauma, transformed, and entire his life he suffered from chronic depression, trapped in an unhappy marriage. There was this duality in Tolstoy as well. One time he wanted to renounce his wealth. He spoke about, like John Lennon, he was talking about the evil of wealth and renunciation, sharing wealth with other people. But one time he took some of the peasants who cut timber in his land to the authorities. So you can see this shifting of these dualities, and he always tried to conceal his secret affairs with peasant women, and that was bothering to his wife. It caused a lot of distress to his wife. That's why the family conflict was there, and eventually he was trapped in a very, very unhappy marriage, and he in the latter part he leaves his house and he wants to go into seclusion, and eventually died in an isolated train station. So it's a form of tragedy, but also Tolstoy writes about human condition and human suffering, and also these people, they try to find certain meaning because probably they were trapped in their own religious philosophies, like Spinoza or Rene Descartes. Because when you are a philosopher, when you are a writer, I have no offense for any people who practice religion. I respect each and every religion and faith and culture, but this is my understanding. Because if you try to write about human condition, if you try to write about the deep philosophy, I think you have to be wide of some of your hardwired pre-existing belief systems. Otherwise, you cannot move away from that your own religious thinking pattern. I think in the latter stages, some of the philosophers, they tried to write about the human condition, going beyond their religious faith, going beyond the accepted some of the commonly shared religious interpretations and versions. So these things are in our mindset. Like we share that commonality, as Carl Jung highlighted. Collective, it's in our collective unconscious. Even though we try to think independently, those things are in the back of our minds. Somehow it affects. And when we are writing about new philosophy, when we try to expand our horizons, we have to come to an understanding that are there any limitations to my thought process? Are there limitations, or whatever my pre-held belief system hinders me? I think this Tolstoy was one of the examples we can give. Like he couldn't go beyond that because of his religious belief system kept him in that frame. When he wrote war and peace. He tried to bring human suffering. If you could remember the officer Andrei Balkonsky, he was looking for glory. He was an unhappy man because he had wealth. He come from aristocracy, and he had a beautiful wife. He left everything and he went to serve under General Kutuzov. He was looking for glory. He wanted to be someone like Napoleon, a person who could change history. He wants to be a part of his history, but there he encounters near-death experience, and after that he become very, very cynical person because his worldview changes. Even his encounter with Napoleon doesn't arouse anything great. Seeing his admirer, even though he was their enemy, seeing Napoleon, it was not a great moment for him. So, and the other character is Pierre Bezouhoff, like who he couldn't integrate into the Petersburg higher society, and he was an illegitimate child of a very, very rich count who had a very, very immoral lifestyle. He was not accepted because of his demeanor, mannerism, and his physical appearance. Then he tried to find meaning by marrying a very beautiful lady called Helen, but her infidelity really, really shatters him. Then he tries to find a meaning through Freemasons. So associating them, he found that there was very, very limited things they could offer. So again, he starts a new mission to kill Napoleon because he thinks that Napoleon is the Antichrist that was described in Book of Revelation 666, the beast. So in his journey, he meets a peasant called Karatev, very kind, very humble, very down to earth, God-fearing, a selfless character. So having conversation with Karatev, Pierre's worldview changes and he witnessed a lot of atrocities. So after becoming a POW, he sees the real world, real tragedy and the horrors of life. Somehow he manages to get escaped and he becomes a new man. So his worldview changes. So these are the things that Tolstoy presents to us, and also discussing about our own life philosophies. I think that's very unique. Writing about trauma, writing about the human suffering, human condition, and also they point out that there's a certain salvation. There's an escape route, so we are not trapped in the dark.
And what is the escape route?
It differs. It should come from you. Once Krishnamurti, the famous Indian philosopher, he says that enlightenment, that aha moment should come from you. As a therapist, you can't pinpoint that escape route for your patient or your client, but you can show the path. You can show the path, and it has to be, it's a sort of self-revelation. That insight should come from you. You can listen to the philosophy. You can understand all these thoughts and all these the sciences, and you have to do this internal processing. After doing this internal processing, then you come to a certain conclusion. And more you read, more you try to understand human condition, there would be certain aha moment. I think Buddha thought that was sort of like an enlightenment, nirvana. And Jesus Christ, he described this as you are connecting with the celestial entities. In every religion that has their own interpretation. So there is certain spiritual moment in all of us. And once you touch that spiritual meaning, you can continue a journey. And thereafter, even any big T trauma or small T trauma doesn't shatter you, because you realize it's a world condition. And sometimes you cannot avoid these traumas, these negativities. And it's you can change your own interpretation and find the meaning. I think Viktor Frankl, he elegantly wrote about this in Man's Search for Meaning, because we always need to find certain meaning. I'll give you one example. I treated BK amputee from Sri Lankan Army. Also, I had the opportunity of discussing his trauma at Coatesville VA in Philadelphia when I was studying under Dr. Susan Rogers, EMDR expert. The same type of trauma, same type of events, like two combatants with BK amputees, but their worldview was different. Cultural factors were different. The Sri Lankan combatant, first I'll talk about the American combatant who lost his leg. He was asking, why me? Do I deserve this? I lost my leg following a landmine, anti-personnel mine, and he couldn't come to terms with his trauma. That bothered him. And every time, he was questioning, why me? So the Sri Lankan combatant with the same trauma, he told me, I have committed something bad in my previous life. So probably this is a retribution. And I accept that. I'm not a believer in reincarnation. Here I'm not here to give a lecture on reincarnation, because I'm a skeptic, because I got these ideas from my former professor, James Alcock, and he made me to critically think about reincarnation research by Dr. Ian Stevenson. I had a lot of doubts about his methodology. I don't say that I'm here promoting the concept of reincarnation, but I'm telling how the cultural factors can change your internal interpretation. So the Sri Lankan combatant says that it was a form of retribution in his previous life. So now he has to reform, and I accept my trauma. Maybe it's a form of delusion. I don't know. People can interpret it in different angles. But here what I'm trying to say is your own interpretation make the suffering inside your head, which you mentioned when we started this discussion. Yeah, your demon is your own creation. So sometimes it's important to process the trauma, perhaps using your cultural heritage, cultural factors. And culture is one of the buffers against psychotrauma.
One of the things I was thinking about when you were speaking, you mentioned the story of Tolstoy. And what I heard or what I read was that when he was at that train station, like where he died, was the beginning of the journey that he was setting out on, that he had been postponing his entire life. That he was like,
Yeah.
that he waited to the very end, and then he's like, okay, I'm gonna do it, and then he goes to the train station, and then he dies. And then in the brothers Karamazov, Dmitri, it's like when he's in Makria, and the police finally, or the police find him and lay out his crimes. I think there's like a psychological shift there. He was a gambler, a womanizer, reckless with money, a drinker, and then he's talking about love. Then he's talking about all these philosophical ideas. But it's once he's already accused of the crime, it's kind of like at the end. And then, throughout the rest of the novel, I don't know, I think there's a big shift there. Then in this other book, called Viper's Tangles, this French book, this really rich, I guess, count landowner. He's kind of estranged from his family his entire life. He's just a mean guy. He's just greedy, doesn't have great relationships with anyone. And then at the very end of his life, he goes through this psychological shift, transforms into, oh, you know what? Maybe I was being too harsh. I was being, all these things. But it's always at the very end. There was another story that you were telling that it was, it's at the very end that you find out these things. And I just wish everyone could push those lessons forward, but it's only through, those lessons or through those kind of pivotal moments that, you either realize the error of your ways or you have the aha moments. But I just I wonder how much people would be saved if they could, have those aha moments earlier in their life. How much more good could come from that. And also when you were talking about cultural interpretations, and how your philosophy limits you or empowers you, I thought that was really interesting too. Because I think I had one comment in one of my YouTube videos, kind of critique and say you're cherry picking between a lot of different philosophies or religious systems. And I'm like, well, wouldn't I want to, I don't really understand the problem with trying to build up a system from many others that, makes sense to me. I don't see how that's cherry picking. I think that that's a totally reasonable way to go about things. It's the most informed way to use culture and use, the things in the world. That's what everyone does. It's building your own worldview, building your own philosophy rather than purely inheriting it. That's what Nietzsche talked about. From my understanding, he was talking about, don't just inherit the values that came before you. Either, come to them on your own. And if you do think all of the values of a particular religious system make sense to you, make them unique to you, make them true, live them with expression. And then also the fact that how do you interpret your trauma? You referenced those two people about how the mortar shells. One person said it sounded like rain, and one person was obviously terrified of it. How you interpret that? What is that? That's so interesting. That people can have such different views on it, and whether that can change or whether that's hardwired. And sometimes I just think one of my favorite quotes is, all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit in a room alone with himself. I think it was, oh gosh, who said that? Mathematician. I forget who it was. And just sitting with that for a while and kind of just letting it move throughout you. Same goes back to the concept of chewing it over, or, what I talked about earlier about bringing it into the light. Those were some of the things I was thinking about when you were talking.
Oh, that's great, Max. Yeah, indeed. It gives a lot of broader understanding. And when you talk about Mithya in Brothers Karamazov, actually, Dostoevsky writes about three personalities: id, ego, and superego. Id, Mithya was id. I want it now. I need money. I want Grushenka. Okay, that's id. And Ivan, he's more realistic. He operates on realistic principles. And superego, Alosha. So prior to Freud, Dostoevsky was talking about these three components. And yes, indeed, as you mentioned, Mithya talks about very, very deep philosophy. This guy is a very, very superficial person. He's interested in money and bodily pleasure. But all of a sudden, he becomes a sort of philosopher. I think that component is inside us, even inside a serial murderer. And one time I spoke to Bukanowski. Bukanowski was the person who interviewed Andrei Chikatilo, Citizen X, if you could remember the movie, Stephen Rea and Donald Sutherland's movie. It's about the Rostov killer, Red Ripper. And yeah, Bukanowski tells me that the, even in a serial murderer, there's a saint hidden inside, inactivated. But the moment you activate that saint, no longer he's a serial murderer. Vice versa. The brain chemistry, if you can change brain chemistry, we can turn a hermit into a serial murderer. Yeah, Max, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, okay, great. So you can put these through parts and do the necessary editing.
Yep.
And and the final phase, you can do the conclusion. So let's talk about Mitya and Brother Karamazov. Actually, you brought a lot of thought-provoking stuff to me, and sort of it refreshes my memory. And indeed, it's as Carl Sagan said, there's a human, there's a horse, and a crocodile inside our minds. Okay, sometimes we become very, very selfish and territorial. That's a human condition. And Freud says that we all are neurotics. So we have our own neurotic conditions. We fight our own demons. We have 24/7, we are no saints. So we have our own issues. But when you read more, when you read philosophical stuff, when you do journaling, when you do meditation, it helps you to fight back these negative elements. So that's the thing you really, really mentioned, which is good. Actually, a Westerner like you, a North American like you, having this sort of understanding, I think it's a great thing. Like we are bridging the East and the West, because I think the Western world, they try to understand the world condition through materialistic views, and it caused a lot of chaos. If you could remember your former like your elderly generation, like the Woodstock, the hippies movement. Okay, so I think you have witnessed these better than me, and the unrest in 1960s in educational institutes that brought a lot of frustration. And somehow the even the Beatles, John Lennon, George Harrison, they came to the East seeking new form of philosophy, but they found something. But in the meantime, they are. I'm not going to mention about things because it could hurt some people. Because I have some of my friends who follow these some of these Eastern philosophies, but there were good elements in them, and there were some pseudo components. I think we had to be very, very truthful when we cater, when we deliver, not to have a financial gain, not to sort of deceive people. and we have to share knowledge. The East has knowledge, the West has knowledge, the West has the advancement in technology, and I don't think there should be certain clash between them. I think we have to extract the good components from each other. In that way, I'm really, really blessed with that, because my early education in Sri Lanka, then I went to Soviet Union, because even in the Soviet system, there were very, very good things that I learned about the living, collaborating with the communities, and they have a good side, even though there are some of the negative aspects, especially bureaucracy and sort of human rights issues, and some of the trauma stemming from Stalinist era. Yeah, indeed, there were certain negativity, but also there were very good things about the Soviet system. I think some of the Scandinavian countries, they got these positive points from the socialist system, and for their capitalistic system, they added these components. And also, once I became a Canadian citizen, I was exposed to North America, and I saw the rich cultural heritage and the humanity, and a lot of positive things in the Western world. And I was in England for a short period. I was studying at Barnsley College, where I studied child psychology. So Eastern Europe and the Western Europe, and I had the opportunity of traveling. Even I went to Romania, I went to Bulgaria, I went to Kishinev. So lived in Ukraine and the Western Ukraine, and so meeting with different people, it broadened my horizons. I think the worldview changes once you have that exposure, and I think we can get a lot of positive stuff from each and every culture, even from people. And I always consider my patients as my textbooks, because I learn from them. Each and every patient is unique, and over the years I have learned trauma not by textbooks, by these people, and it really inspired me to write a number of books about psychological trauma, psychotherapeutic methods, the ancient healing methods, how we bring culture uh, into the this healing system, and even mindfulness. The Kabat-Zinn's, if you read about Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness techniques, and you find the ancient wisdom is there, he accepts that. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't deny it, and that's the beauty of Kabat-Zinn, and he admires it. So if we can bring these elements of mindfulness into the healing of trauma, I think we can provide a lot of comfort for those who suffer, because we know that the entire world is we are fighting with each other. That's human nature. And sometimes I think an extraterrestrials, how they would perceive us, these humans, they would see us as a sort of a destructive nation going towards annihilation, fighting with each other for egoistic things, and we cannot share this little planet. So there are a lot of extraterrestrial research institutes, the SETI, and they have these the lot of apparatus. They try to listen to the extraterrestrial signals, but if a technology psychologically and spiritually developed alien nation, they may not have any interest to us. Who are we? I mean, we are sort of like a decadent, fighting, self-destructive species. So they have nothing to learn from us. As Professor Michiko said once, sometimes they might be talking to whales, they might be talking to dolphins, not to the humans, because they have nothing to learn from us. I don't know. These are some of my thoughts. So I think when we talk about trauma, it's a psychological trauma. It's a huge, broad topic because it was there throughout our history, starting even we know that throughout our human evolution, even the Neanderthals, they experienced psychological traumas. They had certain rituals in order to evade these traumas. And the cavemen, they had their own issues. So when we entered into civilization, we faced huge chunk of distresses created by the system. I think industrialization, like Mark Knopfler writes, the industrial disease. So, and Eric Fromm very, very elegantly write about the distresses and the traumas that we orchestrated, and we induce some of the traumas to our civilization. So we are suffering from that. We are a product of it, and somehow we must find a way for healing, either collective healing or individual healing. And it's very, very important for nations to talk about these, because each and every nation has their own pain body. This was highlighted by Eckhart Tolle. If you take the Japanese, they have their own pain body. And if you take India, they have their own ancient traditional traumas, the pains. And if you take my part, my heritage, Sri Lankans, we have our own pain body. So you can apply to each and every country a culture. So they have their own issues. And it's important to heal as nations, heal as communities, heal as families, groups, and individuals. So we can bring down to the lowest level.
It was Jung who spoke about the inability to express yourself as being like a great hindrance, like a blockage. And then there's so many things that I've been thinking about that connect to this, like free speech and free expression. And the kind of boxes that society puts on thinking, or, you know, who and what you can be. I think that, like, at least for myself, I have like something inside of me that I like want to communicate to the world. And that when that is hindered, I just feel horrible. And this connects to what you were saying about how the philosophies we have kind of can hinder us too. Like this free flowing kind of expression that I have wanting to come out of me is like, you know, a very fundamental part of me. And like that happens at the individual level. And even like when I walk down the street, I like talking to people. I like connecting with people. I like telling people little random parts about me. And it's like all this form of expression, and I want my mind yearns for like largeness and expansion. That's one thing I wanted to ask you about, was whether you've read much on or worked with at all in MDMA assisted PTSD treatment. You know, one thing that psychedelics do, whether it's, psilocybin mushrooms, going back to the 60s, or MDMA, is I think we have, Joe Rogan gave the metaphor of like, you are like a mountain, and you're skiing down, and there are these deep tracks that get built in because we have like these thought patterns that we go through again and again, and it kind of weighs it down. And sometimes maybe with psychedelics, there can be, a huge new layer of snow, and it covers up some of those tracks, or it makes you able to go in new routes again. And so I just think that free expression is like psychologically healthy, and that when you don't have that, it's deeply repressive. That's like, maybe if you don't have friends, that's repressive. Who do I share everything with? Then you lack connectivity. Then you feel isolated. Then you can't see that, everyone deals with suffering, and that suffering is a fundamental part of life. And that it's your reaction to it that determines who you are. That, I guess, that's one thing that I've been thinking about when you were talking, like the psychological benefit of free expression and the expansion of that expression.
Indeed, I concur what you mentioned. Because we all have inner thoughts, and we always sanitize words. We don't really say what we really want to express. Sometimes we say what other person want to hear, and we are not true to ourselves. Even dealing with your own family members, your spouse, your children, your friends. Sometimes
Truth,
we are not.
like truth, like that's the thing.
Yeah, we try to repress our thoughts. We try to repress our feelings, and sometimes we sanitize. And also, in the modern world, we try to be politically correct. And whatever I mention, I have to be very, very cautious, not to hurt anybody's feelings. It's good in a way. It's good. We cannot be very bold and sort of bulldoze things with our speech. That's good. In the other hand, as you mentioned, there's a certain repression is going inside us. Sometimes we may not be expressing the true feelings, and there's no outlet for that. And cumulative effect could cause tension, anxiety, frustration, and it affects your functionality, it affects your relationships, and eventually it affects your mental health. So it's always better and to have a dialogue with yourself, own self dialogue, talk to yourself. I know in some cultures people talk to trees. It's a healing process, and they talk to their pets, and pets are very good listeners. I have a dog. I have a German Shepherd, and throughout this is my third German Shepherd. I always fell in love with shepherds. They're very intelligent, and my Shepherd knows when I'm upset, when I'm sad, when I'm angry, and when I'm happy. He senses. He has very good emotional intelligence, better than a human. So what you mentioned, it's beautiful. Actually, I'm so happy that you are bringing this thing to the table, like a self-healing process, journaling, writing, expressing the free expression, and like discussing the what I mean. Sometimes some of the stuff that we cannot talk about in public. It's good, yeah. And also you mentioned about MDMA and some of the chemicals, the brain stimulants, and also it could act as a depressant. And as a medical doctor, I cannot promote some of the substances, but I have an open mind. I'm not a traditional sort of a medical practitioner, like how our society shifted. One time, heroin, the doctors were prescribing heroin for cough.
Sure.
That was the time. And doctors, during the prohibition time in your own country, doctors were giving prescriptions, alcohol prescriptions for certain patients.
Hmm.
Okay. And we have to understand what's prohibited, what's allowed. It's all social norms. I hope you may have seen the movie Midnight Express.
Hmm.
So in that movie, he says like, "You punish me for trafficking cannabis, but one time cannabis, it was a sort of a medication in Sri
Hmm.
Lanka. In Sri Lanka, the warriors use cannabis, but I have seen the negative side. Cannabis induced psychosis, cannabis induced emotivational syndrome. So whatever the medications you mention, it's not for everybody, perhaps, because we have to see if the person is having PTSD, whether to treat him. I know some of the practitioners in the West now, they treat patients with ketamine, they patient with atropine and MDMA with cannabinoids. But it's like a any form of medication. Let's say now any medicine you give for seizures, you cannot give it to the entire population because you cannot change their brain chemistries. And eventually what happens, I mean, if you there are certain vulnerable people. For instance, if you take in Pink Floyd, Sid Barrett, like he was a brilliant musician, and probably he had other mental health conditions, but accumulated drug abuse sort of destroyed his ability, and eventually that caused his death. And like a person like Marvin Gaye, the brilliant musician, and alcohol, drugs, it consumed them. So and Little Richard and Jimi Hendrix, and my favorite guitarist Tommy Bolin, so gifted person. And I wrote a poem about him, my awesome friend Tommy Bolin. I'll share it with you. And we see a lot of tragedy, a lot of untimely death, how the very, very talented people, their lives being cut short, and they suffered tragic deaths. So when it comes to specific drugs and treating trauma, it's a bit tricky question, because if we open the floodgates, people might self-medicate. So you have to be very, very cautious. But I know some of the therapeutic effects of cannabinoids. I have seen some of our colleagues, doctors, practitioners, treated them and achieved some form of success. But I think it's not very, very universal. You have to pick your patient. So we talk about mindfulness. Sometimes mindfulness can backfire. It could reverberate your traumas, because more you try, if the person is having malignant anxiety, more he tries to practice mindfulness. It's like you keep a rubber ball underwater. It always tries to come up. So this healing process should come within, and we cannot induce, we cannot sort of force them. And it's a gradual process, and it's not linear. It could be sort of like a roller coaster, and a lot of people can relapse, people can one time they were doing good, and all of a sudden, they go into chaos. Sometimes self-destructive behaviors are happening. You have to understand that, because recovery is not linear. Sometimes even with our own selves, like we are not 24/7 happy. We have our upside downs, we have our roller coasters type of emotions. And with time, with our life experiences, with reading, journaling, meditation, even associating friends, pets, doing sports. I'm not a very, very sporty guy, but I do swimming. Like I like swimming. So that's my passion. And yeah, so even having a hobby, it helps you. So when you talk about happiness, I've spoken to people who were in Nazi Holocaust. I have spoken to Nazi Holocaust survivors in the Soviet Union. Once I went to a small town called Himelsky, where I met several individuals, very, very old. They were in Nazi concentration camps. They survived. And there was another gentleman who was taken as a forced labor to work in one coal mine in Ruhr area in Germany. Also, I spoke to Gulag survivors in the Soviet Union and some of the POWs in Sri Lanka. I put the one common question. I asked during your captivity, were there some happy moments, self-contained moments? They said yes. Even though even the bondage, even the deplorable situation, even the dreaded situation I was living, there were sort of happy moments. Happy moments in the sense you are not euphoric. You are not laughing. I mean, it's laughing out loud. But certain content in the face of destruction, in the face of despair. So we have to redefine what is happiness. As I mentioned earlier, take that two guys, one guy from Vegas, like having all the comforts. Okay, he's driving a Lexus and he has a beautiful house, beautiful family, but still unhappy. He's always complaining. He says, I'm not happy with this, I'm not happy with that, I'm not happy with my job, I'm not happy with my house. Whereas these Roma people in Romania, nothing. They don't have any property. They don't, only, very, very few things in their life, but they were happy. They were singing. So we see the contrast. I think we have to redefine trauma, redefine the content. We have to redefine what is happiness and also our motivations. I think it opens a huge philosophical conversation. I think Nietzsche, he wrote about this herd mentality and the traditional religions, like how it affected our collective thinking. And he wanted to create this Superman. But unfortunately, Nazis hijacked his idea and gave a wrong interpretation. I think that was a very, very bad thing happened to Nietzsche and disregarded as a philosopher. I started reading Nietzsche more and more, and I find a lot of sense in him. But in his personal life, Nietzsche had a lot of issues. He was affected by the Persia, the war because he worked as a medical orderly and affected by war trauma. And also he was subjected to a lot of harassments at the university, and some of the professors didn't like him, and they told the students not to attend his lectures, and he was disregarded for a long time. And some people thought that he was a buffoon, but the fact remains that he was a brilliant person. And during his time, some of the people, intellectuals, educated people, couldn't comprehend him. But now we revisit and try to understand him more and more, and makes more sense about the contemporary society that we live in. And Nietzsche, he was a Zarathustra, a prophet.
At one point, I think, is dukkha the word that suffering gets translated out from in Buddhism? I'm asking you, is dukkha, that word you were speaking about earlier, is that the word, they like one of the fundamental tenements in Buddhism, the first, the Four Noble Truths is that life is
Hmm.
suffering. Is in that first one, life is suffering, is in Hindi or whatever it is, that is it says life is dukkha? Because I've heard that suffering is a bit of a mistranslation. And I heard one time that it could be translated as unsatisfactoriness, which is the one that I relate to the most. And when you're talking about, the person in Las Vegas who has everything, yet, still wants more. Like the fact that we're in a constant state of like in between or unsatisfactoriness. That's like why rich people can be sad. Um, like controlling your desires to some degree, or at least editing them and thinking through them rather than letting them completely control you, um, I think is really important. Like not having no desires, because one thing I've thought about before is how do you reconcile, you know, some people frame Eastern religions as not non-practical, non-action. You're just sitting there. We're in the world now. You can't really be non-active. You need to set goals and move towards things, but it's not really that you shouldn't have goals, that you shouldn't have values. It's just to really think through the things you're valuing, think through the things that you want, um, making them your own, not wanting to, have all the things because, you know, you've been told that those are the right things to have. Um, because then you can, reach the quote unquote top of the mountain and then realize, well, these aren't the things that I should have been valuing, the whole time. So I've always kind of been intrigued by that definition. Life is unsatisfactoriness. And then so much of that, unsatisfactoriness and suffering comes from our attachment and desire to things. And then I guess, Buddhism lays out the eightfold path that it's like kind of just do your best, be thoughtful, be calm, tell the truth, and and realize that the things at the end aren't going to make you happy. Like it's the process along the way. It's who you can become. It's the people you can connect with and affect positively. Um, I guess that's like meaning of life type thing. The point of your life, how you can frame that for yourself. Um, and that's Epicureanism too. Is simple pleasures, friendship, knowledge, learning, connection with people, love of family. Like the simpler, the better. And I just think that's totally misguided because one thing I think about, we have 8 minutes left, just FYI on this before we conclude, and I'll give us, a little 1 minute buffer, is like Nietzsche said, God is dead. We have killed him with, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and that we don't have. It's harder to have a shared moral framework and a common belief. We're not subjugated by really a greater good. Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, or Ivan said, if there is no God, then all things are lawful. And then, like, where do we go from here? That's what Nietzsche said, and then he proposed his new system of value creation and interpretation. And I think that's one thing that we're struggling with right now. We're seeing, especially, I mean, at least in the West, from what I can see, like consumerism and fame and money and social status and all of these things basically becoming our gods, becoming the things we value most, the things that we think will give meaning to our lives. And I don't want to sound like a complete anarchist, but maybe those will give you some happiness or pleasure, but I don't think those are like the sustained deep sources of meaning, like regenerative sources of meaning. Um, and then there's also the battle that each of us has to face. Like you were talking about psychedelics and that they're not all for everyone. And I think that it's each of our own responsibilities to treat ourselves like a patient. Like what if you saw your friend that was completely fucked off and lazy, what would you tell them? You would say, go to the gym. You would say, you know, journal, you'd say read, you say go connect with people, get a good job, whatever it may be. And so I think of all of these, I think of philosophy, I think of the whole entire world as my toolkit to build myself into the person that I want to be: calm, connected with the world, thoughtful, wise. Like these are the values that I hold. And that in that vacuum of a top-down moral framework religion that is imposed on us, that it is our responsibility, and it's a great responsibility to do the work to establish your own worldview, your own philosophy, your own outlook that makes sense to you. And that I don't, and that's like a very key core thing that all of us have to go through. And I just don't know how much I don't know how much like the normal person kind of understands that. And I think that, I don't know what that can lead to. Probably, just more time spent online, more looking for outlets, more gambling, more, drug taking, as, what can I do to make myself feel like how I want to feel? I think these are all connected. And without the inner work of doing it for yourself, then you're never even going to come close. You're not going down the right path.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Max. Yeah, you elaborated on that very elegantly. Yes, we sometimes we are not happy with the materialistic possessions that we have and the social status, and its discontent is there. But I think when Buddha said there's unsatisfactoriness is associated in our lives, it's not. I think it's there's a certain misinterpretation as well, because these days I deconstruct Buddha's life and the issues that he faced. And when he mentioned that the life is full of these, the component of dukkha, it means it's the life is not full of despair, disappointment, sadness. I think we made an error interpreting that, because he made a very, very, when he said dukkha, it's a very, very universal thing. It's a summation of your happinesses, summation of your negative things. And when it's not like sort of sadness and you escape from your life, you run away from your life. It's not that. I think a lot of people, even die-hard Buddhists, they misunderstood. So when Buddha said renunciation, it doesn't mean that you get rid of all your material possessions. It's not that. You can still have a Rolex, you can enjoy that. You can have a Ferrari, you can enjoy that. But you're not going to cling into that. You know that this is temporary, and one day this would be scrap metal. If you have that understanding, you won't fall into that trap of unhappiness. I can give one example, because one time I was attached to York University, some housing project, and they gave me a BlackBerry phone. It was sort of that, during that time, it was like a huge prestige thing, like having a BlackBerry. So I tried to apply this Buddha's concept to this. And looking at that, I was happy, but I didn't have an extra craving for that. So I knew, my friend, I'm happy that I have this BlackBerry, but one day we had to say goodbye to each other. So
Yeah,
after the project,
that's it, accepting the impermanence of life.
Yeah, after the project, I had to hand it over back, and there was no sadness in me. I was not shattered. I was not upset. Like, it didn't cause me any psychological distress, permanent or otherwise. So that was a very, very simple thing that I applied. So some people think that, if you have wealth, you have vehicles, you have expensive stuff, you get rid of that and you go to a forest and you meditate. That's not Buddhism. I think a lot of people, even some people in Sri Lanka who are very, very pious people who follow Buddhism and who had read Buddhist text, because it's like the Bible, you know. Most of the Buddhist text, it's not the original version. Over the years, a lot of Hindu ideas, Jainas ideas mixed with Buddhism. So we don't know what Buddha really taught us. But while reading that, you can sort of guess maybe this is not a Buddha script. Because Buddha, he was not speaking against wealth. He was not speaking against being happy. So some people say that, I mean, if you're happy for some materialist thing, it's bad. It's sort of against your faith. No, it's wrong. It's a very, very radical interpretation. And you have seen in each and every religion there are radical interpretations. So it's very hard to find what is the true essence. But what I understand when I deconstruct the the Buddha's life and Buddhism, I find it's something different. Like he talks about being happy, being content, and enjoy your life. And if you have a Rolex, it's okay. Be happy, but make sure that it's not permanent. Like one day, it would go. And the entire Buddhism, it's about being in the present moment. If you try to sort of narrow it down, it's about